hoping of course, that I am not jinxing it just a few days before patch 10.0.7, I wanted to have a discussion with you, big thinkers, a question to have, which is, how do you think the balancing of the specs have been so far in Season 1 of Dragonflight? Because these specs being balanced, the specs being good, being strong, or being weak, is often a big reason as to players enjoying a certain patch, enjoying a raid, or enjoying a Mythic Plus season. It always feels bad when you end up playing a spec and your spec starts getting ignored or declined once you reach certain keys, for example, or the feeling that you start having that you need to start re-rolling, you need to start changing to a different spec if you want to see more of the content, for example. So let's start with the question about tanks. How would you describe the balancing of tanks in Season 1 of Dragonflight? The season started with quite the already preconceived notion that Protection Warrior was the strongest tank and that the second best, more or less, was Blood Death Knight. This seems to have continued, I would say, throughout the season. At the start, perhaps, there was more experimenting. I remember seeing a few more Vengeance Demon Hunters, for example, at the start of the season, even more Brewmaster Monks at the start of the season. But as the season went by, it was quite clear that those were the more feasible tanks. And now I'm talking about both Mythic Plus and the Raid. They were kind of similarly popular, and then Protection Warrior started, growing a little bit more, given that once you wanted to push high keys in Mythic Plus, that's who you had to play. And now the more important question about tanks, which is, what did Blizzard do to change this balancing? It's okay if at the start of the season it's like this. What was actually done with hot fixes and with patches to change any of this? Well, Guardian Druid and Brewmaster Monk and Vengeance Demon Hunter have not really moved. So, the only one who is prone to receive a good amount of changes over time and is now becoming more and more popular is Protection Paladin. So, we might end the season, the first season of Dragonflight, with 3 decent tanks. Blood, Prot Warrior, and Prot Paladin. And that is 3 out of 6. To me, the balancing of tanks have been quite good. If you manage to have 50% of your entire tank specs to be good and viable, I think that's a good decision, a good way to balance the tanks. Of course, it's unlucky, it's unfortunate for specs like Vengeance and specs like Guardian and Brewmaster, but a 50% rate is pretty good for tanks. Now, what about the healers? So the healers had the new entry of the new spec, the Preservation Evoker, of course. From the get-go, Preservation Evoker was the strongest and the more popular of the healers, together with Restoration Druid. This went for both Mythic Plus and for the Raid. Very similar to Protection Warrior and to Blood Death Knight. Unlike the tanks throughout the season, Blizzard did try. To be fair, let's give them some credit. Blizzard did try to keep buffing some of the other healers, to the point where even 10.0.7 will continue to buff these specs. However, to this point, not really much has changed when it comes to healers. The predominance of Resto, Druid, and Preservation Evoker is still here. So I would say the balance of the healers has been a little bit worse, right? If the tank balance was a solid and healthy 7.5 out of 10, this one is closer to a 6, A couple of healers viable, a couple of more were still okay, in particular in the raid, so it's barely acceptable, but nothing special when it comes to healers. Blizzard could have done better in that regard. Now, let's move over to the melee DPS. So, the melee DPS has been the best role overall to have more variety, to have more options to be viable somewhere, right? Since the start of Mythic Plus, you had some familiar faces in the meta, because specs like Havoc, specs like Windwalker, specs like Rogue in general, but in particular Outlaw at the start, even specs like Fury Warrior, were the popular picks. And then as we went deeper in Mythic Plus, we had a few changes, a few buffs to other specs, like for example Arms Warrior, like for example Subtlety Rogue now has overtaken Outlaw, and now you also have Enhancement Shaman becoming much more viable. So at this point I have already mentioned something like 8 different specs being good and viable at certain times in Mythic Plus, which is more than half of the whole melee DPS spec population, which is very good in terms of meta for Mythic Plus. For the raid, as we always mention, at this point you guys should all know, we all the time point out when you look at the meta and the rankings of the raid how many melee DPS are towards the top in the raid compared to the range DPS. We have had multiple specs throughout the season being towards the top. At certain moments we had pretty much all the rogue specs, and even now 2 of the rogue specs have been towards the top. We also had specs like Arms, as well as Fury, as well as Enhancement, as well as Havoc Demon Hunter. We also had both of the DK specs at times being towards the top, Feral Druid as well. So in the raid as well, the choices and the variety of the balance for the melee has been quite good. I think that if the tanks were closer, I think that if the tank were on a 7.5 in terms of balancing for Season 1, I think definitely when it comes to melee, purely based on the options you had for the specs for you to play at a good, decent, competitive level, then it's closer to a 9 out of 10 for the role. Yes, as usual, of course, there have been more unlucky specs, which did not receive that much attention, or even the attention they received was not enough. In particular, this season we had Survival Hunter, we had Assassination Rogue, we had later on down the line Frost Death Knight, and also Red Paladin, which is also bound to get reworked. But for the majority of the specs in the melee camp has been quite good of a season. The last of the roles is the ranged DPS. Ranged DPS are a bit harder to gauge because they have not been nearly as powerful as the melee DPS. So they were sort of all closer towards the bottom than the melees, who were all closer towards the top. So it's harder to gauge who was really strong. But since the start of the season, in Mythic Plus you had specs like a Marksmanship Hunter starting very strong, Arcane Mage, and Demo Warlock. And now we are towards the end of the season and we have Balanced Druid and Shadow Priest. So basically a complete turnover of who is currently powerful in Mythic Plus thanks to the changes that these specs received. In the raid, those Mythic Plus specs were also the more popular ones, with a few other additions that changed over time, because now you had, for example, Devastation Evoker doing better in the raid, you had Beast Mastery Hunter doing significantly better on single target, currently being the best of the single target specs, for example. Mage specs having a turnover, Arcane falling down heavily in favor of Fire Mage, for example. But these changes for the ranged, unlike the melee, were much more volatile. They were not nearly as established and as long-term as the power gained by the specs for the melee. Unlike the melee, for example, we had plenty of options which have not been strong for a lot of the season. For example, you had Destruction Warlock, you had Affliction Warlock, Elemental, Shaman, you had Frost Mage and Fire Mage for big parts of the season, not being very popular, very powerful. Even Devastation, which is somewhat strong now in the raid, still had to go for 2+ months of being quite weak. Somewhat same for Shadow Priest, which has grown a lot in Mythic Plus, but only after the recent buffs, so you had to spend a couple of months of being much lower down in terms of power. And it's not that the changes added, that's the main problem. It's not that the changes to ranged added Shadow Priest to the top, added Devastation to the top, and added Balanced Druid to the top, together with Demo, with Arcane, with Marksmanship. Those 3 specs went to the top, and the 3 specs who were previously at the top went away, lost a lot. So it's not that you have more options, it's not that you went from 3 viable specs to 6 viable specs. You went from 3 viable specs to 3 different viable specs, but the numbers stayed the same, unlike the melee DPS. So it has definitely not been that good, that varied of a season in terms of balance and viability for the range DPS, not of course nearly as close to the melee, and also I would say lower down than the tanks as well. Perhaps maybe to the same level of the healers in terms of variety, in terms of viability so far in the first season. So what is left to see, of course, is the tail end of this season after 10.0.7, just to see if for the last couple of months of this season 1 we have a few more options, a few more changes, a few more specs rising and becoming more viable and more popular for all of the roles. And of course, as always, worth mentioning, this is going to be more important not to see who is strong now in Season 1, at this point is not very relevant, it's more important to see who is going to be popular and powerful as we get into Season 2, to see who might become one of the popular ones for Season 2. That's where the important bit is going to be after 10.0.7. So this was the point for today's video. I think the spec balancing done in Season 1 overall as an average has been decent, has been good enough, although with some room for improvement, in particular for the healers and for the ranged DPS. Of course, you can let me guys know what do you think about this. Perhaps you have completely different ideas about the balancing in Season 1. That's how I think it went so far as PvE is concerned at the very least. Maybe PvP has been a complete disaster, I don't know. Anyways, with this being said, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your pathetic first day of the week on this Monday. Thank you guys, of course, for watching. We are thanking the Patreon supporters as well for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You still have tons of free ways to show your support. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel too. Also, more free ways to support. You can follow me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So, with these social unpleasantries out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, very likely. And in the meantime, why has my voice aged 25 years today? It's interesting. It's actually no voice filter. It's just natural.